Will there ever be a world government? What do you think? There never has been, but will there be someday? Woodrow Wilson hoped there would be, and that's one of the reasons that he led the United States into World War I. Woodrow Wilson was a college professor before he became President of the United States. He was a college professor before he became Governor of New Jersey and then President of the United States. He was a professor of political science and history. He had studied governments. He had studied how governments evolved, what governments did, the different forms that governments took. He had studied parliamentary systems of government like Great Britain's. He had studied presidential systems of government like that of the United States. He had attended law school, and so he knew about law, and he thought a lot about international law. And he concluded that there was a fundamental flaw in the way humans organized their affairs. And the flaw had to do with international affairs. And the flaw became glaringly, appallingly apparent upon the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914. Wilson had not expected that his would be a war presidency. In fact, shortly before he was inaugurated, he told a journalist that it would be the irony of fate if foreign affairs played a large role in his presidency. He had almost no experience in foreign affairs. He was not well traveled. He hadn't studied up on the way nations interacted with each other. His study of politics really had to do with domestic politics, domestic in the United States, domestic in other countries, because he was looking at governments. And the thing that was missing in international affairs was an international, a world government. And what this meant was that when a country had a grievance against another country, there was very little recourse except to go to war. And this recapitulated a situation, a circumstance in human affairs that was often identified with Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher of hundreds of years earlier, who talked about a war of all against all. And prior to what came to be called the social contract, if you were living in a state of nature, if you were in a tribe or your tribe was living among other tribes, if somebody from another tribe killed one of your tribes, your fellow tribespersons, then the only way that you could get vindication, get revenge, was to go and kill one of theirs. So basically, you had to go to war with them. And this was the situation of humans until the discovery or the creation, invention of governments. And the reason that people created governments, according to this social contract theory, was so they wouldn't have to wage war against each other. If my neighbor wrongs me, then I don't go and shoot him. No longer this eye for an eye business, but basically we call in the authorities. We look to government to rectify the wrong, and the deterrent power of government is what keeps order. So people in any society where there is a government that actually exists and works, they obey the law. They obey the law partly because good laws coincide with most people's notions of right and fairness, but also for those people who don't have such notions, they have to fear that the government's going to come arrest them. The government's going to imprison them. In extreme cases, the government might execute them. But the point is that individuals, when they enter society, and nobody claims that there was a time when everybody said, okay, we're going to get rid of that old version, we'll adopt this new version. Now, this thing evolved over time. But under the social contract, individuals give up some of their individual sovereignty. And they say, if I am wronged, I don't take it upon myself to avenge the wrong. No, I appeal to the government, to the legal authorities, and they, on behalf of the entire community, on behalf of the people, and this is why if you go to criminal trials, it's the people of New York or the people of Texas against so-and-so. So it's the people acting collectively against the wrongdoers. And what this does is, yes, it does cost individuals a certain autonomy. You no longer have the freedom to pull out your gun or your knife or your brass knuckles or whatever and go beat that person up who stole your stereo or whatever it might be. No, you leave it to the police. But in exchange, and most people consider it a fair deal, a good deal, there's greater order. So we don't have to walk down the street most of the time worrying that we're going to be mugged and our money and other stuff is going to be stolen. No, you get this social contract provides order. You give up a little bit of your individual liberty, a little bit of your individual autonomy, your individual sovereignty, but in exchange you get order, and people can live at peace. And in civilized countries, in countries that have governments that operate, this is the norm. The details of the social contract, the details of the legal system and the political environment, they differ from country to country. So things look differently in Britain than they do in the United States, and differently in Mexico than they do in Argentina and in India or in China. But basically, that's there. And this is sort of how you know you have a country with a government. Because a government, basically, I mean, one of the definitions of government, it is that institution in a country that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, that has a monopoly on the legitimate authority to coerce people, to make people do stuff. Government is the only agency that does that. Other people, they might extort you or they might, at gunpoint make you do something, but that's not legitimate. Anyway, so Wilson studied that kind of stuff, and he saw that different countries around the world instituted governments differently, but, and it all worked fine, or at least as well as it does, within countries. But what about when the countries themselves are bad actors against other countries? And of course, countries had been bad actors with respect to other countries as long as they've been countries. Bad actors, it means they go to war. So countries go to war. And why do they go to war? Because there is no higher authority to which they can appeal. Again, if your neighbor wrongs you, steals your car, and you're living in a governed society, you don't go after your neighbor, you call the cops. And the cops go after the neighbor. And peace and order are a result of this. If country A attacks country B, well, if the analogy to life within a country, if that analogy worked, then country A would appeal to, or the one that's aggrieved, let's say it's country B, would appeal to the world government, and the world government would step in and fix things up or punish country A. Except in 1914, there wasn't a world government. Now, there had been approximations of world government at various times in history. So big empires, the Roman Empire, back 2,000 years ago. The Roman Empire controlled nearly all of the land around the Mediterranean Sea. And because the Roman Empire existed, if people in North Africa got in a dispute with other people in North Africa, or people in Spain got in a dispute with people in southern France, or something like that, then the aggrieved party could appeal to the government at Rome, or the government of Rome just take it upon itself to insist on norms and laws and stuff like that. So empires, and the Roman Empire was just one empire of many. There was a Greek Empire under Alexander. There was a big empire under Napoleon. The British had a big empire in the 19th century. One of the things that empires did was to act as partial versions of world government. And so when the British took control of India, they were able to leverage a relatively small number of British troops and a relatively small amount of British power to gain control of all of India, because the bickering groups within India, well, first of all, they couldn't all get together to throw the British out, but many of them found it useful to have this higher government that they could appeal to. And so successful empires delivered peace even as they often extracted resources. They insist on taxes or privileged treatment for their merchants. In fact, in the days of Rome, the period when Rome pacified the Mediterranean region was called in Latin the Pax Romana, the Roman peace of Rome. And so this was kind of one of the useful aspects of empires. And empires have gotten bad press over the years, and the imperialists are in it for their own good. But the fact that empires lasted so long often reflected the fact that they provided some service in return for that which they extracted. Anyway, it wasn't always the case by any means, and that wasn't the overriding purpose for doing, but in some cases it was a beneficial side effect. Anyway, another version of a world government was the Catholic Church over the centuries. And so the Pope in Rome wasn't a czar and wasn't a president, but the Pope in Rome had moral authority, religious authority, over Catholics around the world. And before the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s in Europe, basically, 95% or more of Europeans were Catholics. And there were lots of Catholics in Latin America. By the 1500s, there's some. The Spanish Empire was just getting going in the Americas. But the Pope had a lot of sway. And when two Catholic countries got in a fight, then the Pope could step in and say, wait a minute, here's how we're going to adjudicate this. So, for example, Spain and Portugal had a beef about which one of those two countries, both of them eager explorers of new lands and new sailing routes, they were bickering over who got to claim which territory. And so the Pope stepped in and said, all right, Spain, you get all the stuff to the west of this line that goes down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And Portugal, you get all the new stuff, all the new discoveries east of that line. And it was thought that, okay, the Spanish were most active in the Americas, and the Portuguese had been most active down the coast of Africa and around the tip of Africa into what they called the Indies, India and the East Indies. And so that seemed like a fair dividing. And the fact is that it was the Pope who negotiated the division. Now, this is one of the reasons that that Brazil speaks Portuguese, that Portuguese is the language of Brazil. And this because at the time the Pope drew the line, and the line was agreed on between Spain and Portugal, nobody realized how far to the east the bulge of South Africa went. And so this line, it went straight down. It was supposed to go more or less down the middle of the Atlantic, but it went down, and it cut off the eastern part of that bulge of South America. And the Portuguese said, well, see, look, under the deal, we get that. And so they planted some colonies along the coast of Brazil. And at first, they just got this little part of it. But then those colonies were near the mouth of the Amazon River. And the way things tended to work in those days, if you had territory at the mouth of a river, you would claim the entire river basin. And nobody knew how big the Amazon was then. But this is why Brazil is the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world. It was kind of an accident, but it reflects the fact that Spain and Portugal listened to what the Pope said. So the Pope acted as a kind of world government for world Catholics. Anyway, in 1914, there was no such thing as a world government. The Pope no longer had such sway. The Pax Romana had gone away, and the empires of the world were now competing one with the other. So within the British Empire, there might be relative peace, but between the British Empire and the French Empire and the German Empire and the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, there were often collisions, clashes. And there was no higher authority to appeal to. And so, for example, when Britain and France, when explorers, soldiers of Britain and France, they met in the heart of Central Africa, and they were trying to decide who controls the headwaters of this particular stream. And they almost started a war between the empires over this little thing. And it kind of heightened the recognition that we got to do something about this. One of the big stories maybe the big story of European politics in the last decades of the 19th century, of the 1800s, and the early decades of the 1900s was the emergence of Germany. Germany was just a figure of speech until about the 1870s, when the different parts of the German-speaking world began to come together to create the German Empire. And this German Empire had big ambitions, it had lots of resources, and it began to start to throw its weight around, worrying the British and the French and the Russians. And those three countries, Britain, France, Russia, they decided they needed to get together to ally against this German threat. And the Germans felt surrounded. They formed an alliance with the Austrian Empire and with the Ottoman Empire. And so you get these lineup of empires. And then in the summer of 1914, the second in line, the next in line to the Austrian throne, got assassinated. And one thing led to another. And these two alliance systems started creaking into action, and war resulted. And Woodrow Wilson, looking at this from the outside, said, oh my God, this is terrible. In the first place, this huge war, because it soon became the biggest war in world history till then, this huge war resulted from this relatively minor event. Why couldn't the disputants at this just get together and have some, either negotiate it out themselves or have somebody say, look, you guys, this is the way it's going to work out. We need an arbitrator. We need a mediator, like the Pope or somebody like that. But there wasn't that equivalent of a world government. Now, Wilson hoped that the United States could stay out of World War I. And he called upon Americans to be neutral. He declared to the world that the United States was going to be neutral in this European war. And he called upon the American people to be neutral in thought and emotion as well as in deed. So he could declare for the United States neutrality. The United States as a country is not officially going to enter the war. But he wanted Americans not to root for one side or the other, because he figured that if they did start rooting for one side or the other, then the United States being a democracy, there would be pressure on government to come to the aid of the side that they were rooting for, and he didn't want that. And in fact, in 1914, most Americans didn't either. They didn't want to get involved in Europe's affairs. Many of them patted themselves on the back for either themselves or their ancestors having left Europe and leave the quarrels of Europe behind. But Wilson discovered that it was easier saying the United States was going to stay out of the war than keeping the United States out, because the war in Europe presented a tempting opportunity for American merchants, American manufacturers, American shippers. The belligerent parties, they needed supplies to fight their war. They needed food, they needed guns, they needed just all the stuff that countries burn through during wartime. And the United States had this big manufacturing base. It could produce all this stuff. It had all these farms that could produce wheat and corn and all the other stuff. And so American farmers, American manufacturers, they started selling goods to the belligerents, to the countries at war. And it was great business. When the war began in 1914, the U.S. economy was in a rather sharp recession. A lot of underutilized manufacturing and farming facilities. Comes the war, and all of a sudden, the American economy snaps out of the recession. Prices go up, and American farmers are making money hand over fist, and American merchants are making tons of money, and American shippers are making lots of money, and American workers in the factories, they're making money. Everybody's making money, and this is great. This overseas war is a good business. But the different sides in the war, they try to prevent American goods from getting to their enemies. So the British blockade the countries allied with Germany, and the Germans start sinking ships that are carrying goods to France and Britain. They use submarines, U-boats. And Americans, and the American government on their behalf, complain because the United States had long stood for the principle of neutral rights. If the United States is not involved in a war, then American merchants, American shippers should be able to trade with both parties to the war and not have their rights infringed upon, and not be hindered in their trade. This was something that the United States had asserted since the 1790s and gotten the United States in trouble in wars between Britain and France back then, and it started getting the United States in trouble in the war between Britain and France and Russia on one side, and Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire, that's Turkey basically, on the other side. And Wilson felt obliged to stand up for American neutral rights. Not that he had the soul of a merchant or of a capitalist, but this was something that the United States had long insisted on, and so he could hardly surrender that. And furthermore, he liked the fact that this wartime commerce had pulled the United States out of its recession. And he was thinking about, well, I'd like to get reelected. And it'd be a lot easier to get reelected if the economy's booming. And I can say, look, I did this and the economy's booming, so reelect me. But if he says, no, 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 Americans can't trade with those other countries, then the recovery will fizzle, the recession will set in, and he'll probably be a one-term president. So Wilson stands up for American neutral rights. Things get a little bit dicier when the countries in Europe that are buying these goods run out of money, because in a war, you burn through money really fast. And so they didn't have any money to pay for the goods they wanted to buy from the United States. So what do people do if they want to buy something and they don't have the cash to pay for it? What do you do if you want to buy a car and you don't have the money to buy the car? You don't have the cash to buy the car. What do you do if you want to buy a house and you don't have the money, you don't have the cash to buy the house? What do you do? What do you do if you go to the store and you want to buy a pair of shoes and you didn't bring along enough cash? What do you do? Well, in the case of the shoe store, you pull out your credit card and you pay for it that way. Basically, you borrow money. You borrow money to buy a car, you get a car loan, borrow money, you get a mortgage to buy a house. You borrow money to buy stuff. When you want the stuff, you're sure you have the resources over time to pay for it, but you don't have the cash on hand, you borrow it. So the European countries came to the United States and said, can we borrow money in the United States to pay for all this stuff? And Wilson was really stressed out by this because he recognized that if he gave them permission to borrow money in the United States, then all of a sudden, he would be under more pressure to make sure that those loans didn't go bad. If the British borrowed a bunch of money from American bankers and the British were on the ropes, then the bankers would start to think, boy, if the British lose, we're never going to get our loans repaid. And there would be a lot of pressure on Wilson, on the U.S. government, to go to war on behalf of Britain, even if that didn't necessarily lie in the interests of the United States. So Wilson was reluctant to give permission to U.S. banks to lend money to the belligerent nations. But he finally had his arm twisted when it was pointed out once again that, if we can't sell these goods, then the recovery will fizzle and you might not get reelected. So Wilson says, okay, let them borrow the money. And that dragged the United States even closer to war. But there was one thing that really pushed Wilson over the edge toward American participation in the war. And that was a recognition that if the United States did not get involved in the war, then the United States would have no say in the settlement at the end of the war. And here's where Professor Wilson, the professor in Wilson, kicks in. Because he's looking at all this and he's saying, what was the cause of this war? It was the fact that there was no higher government, no world government, no international organization above the countries involved in the war. And so, when Germany had a complaint against Britain, or France had a complaint against Austria, the only way of resolving those disputes, of dealing with those complaints, was go to war. It's as though this was in a pre-civilized society before the social contract. What Wilson wanted to do, he was a big thinker, he was an institutional thinker, he said, what we need is a world government. We need an international organization that can deal with these issues. And he knew that he might be able to give stirring speeches on the subject. He was a good speaker. He might be able to write compelling essays supporting the idea of a world government. He was an articulate guy in writing as well. But that simply wouldn't cut it. What he needed was a seat at the negotiating table at the end of the war. And the only way you get a ticket to the peace conference is you have to go to war. You have to buy your way to the peace conference with troops on the ground in the war. And this is what made up Wilson's mind. And so he took the United States into the war. And in April 1917, he requested from Congress a war declaration. And he said that the United States needed to go to war to make the world safe for democracy. And it wasn't that he was saying the world has to become democratic all at once, but democracies like the United States couldn't live in fear of autocracies elsewhere. And his thinking coalesced around the idea of what came to be called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a proto-world government. It wouldn't govern the world in all matters. It would be an international body that was set up primarily to resolve disputes among nations. And the idea was that if nations did have disputes, they would take them to the League of Nations. And the League of Nations would say, okay, you're right, or you're half right, and you're half right, or do something like this. Furthermore, if nations refused to abide by the rulings of the League of Nations, the League of Nations would employ the principle of collective security. Collective security. This is an international version of the social contract. Collective security. All the nations of the world, all the law-abiding, peace-loving nations of the world, would make sure to enforce the law, enforce world norms against bad-acting nations. So, if country A attacks country B, instead of country B having to defend itself all by itself, no. All the other countries, members of the League of Nations, countries C, D, E, F, G, and so on, would put together an army, and they would go and they would liberate, or they would safeguard country B, and then they would punish country A. Now, an objection to this was that, boy, there are enough squabbles around the world, enough conflicts around the world, that the League of Nations is going to be busy full time. No, no, said Lincoln. The secret of collective security of the League of Nations is exactly the same thing as the secret of the social contract. Because police forces exist, and because potential criminals, most of them anyway, know that if they commit a crime, they're going to get caught and punished, likewise, that country A, which has a gripe against country B, thinks, okay, should we attack country B? And the answer will be no, because if we do, we'll have to face the wrath of countries C, D, E, F, G, and the whole League of Nations. And so, in fact, said Lincoln, and supporters of the League of Nations, far from being a recipe for more wars, the League of Nations and the principle of collective security would be a recipe for fewer wars. So, the United States goes into World War I, and the American side wins. Wilson goes to the peace conference, and he writes into the treaty that ends the war the charter of the League of Nations. And he hopes that the United States will take a leading position in the League of Nations. However, he hasn't done enough spade work at home. He hasn't prepared the ground enough. And when he brings the Treaty of Versailles, as it was called, for the place where it was signed, a suburb of Paris, Americans, in particular, the Senate, rejected the Treaty of Versailles. Now, to ratify a treaty, you have to get a 2/3 majority. And Wilson could have gotten a majority, but he didn't get the 2/3 majority. This was complicated by the fact that Wilson suffered a stroke and in the middle of this debate and all this. But a lot of it had to do with the fact that Americans just at that point didn't seem to be ready for a world government. For the next 20 years, the world was without a world government. The League of Nations actually did get up and running, but the United States was not a member. And if you have an organization like this where the most powerful country in the world is not a member, then it's really not going to have much clout. But when the Second World War happened, Americans said, you know what? Woodrow Wilson was right. We need something like the League of Nations. They wouldn't call it the League of Nations. They called it the United Nations. And the United Nations was formed during and at the end of World War II, and the United States took a leading position. The United States was a sponsor, a charter member of the United Nations. And the United Nations has been with us ever since. It has been criticized sometimes for trying to do too much. It's been criticized at other times for doing too little. But it leaves open the question of whether there should be a world government. There's not a world government in the sense that the United Nations can pass laws that say that you, a resident, a citizen of Texas, have to do this. The United Nations operates through governments, through national governments, not upon individuals. The way the original Articles of Confederation of the United States operated on state governments rather than on individuals. But there have been plenty of occasions during the period since World War II, when a lot of people thought we need something like a world government or something that has teeth. And over the last 10 or 15 years, probably the most pressing issue where it's causing people to say we need international cooperation and enforceable cooperation is on the issue of climate change. Because with climate change, if some people continue to pump out CO2 and while others cut back, then the problem doesn't get resolved. What is necessary is international cooperation, and maybe for something closer to a world government. Will it ever come into existence? Maybe.